Hello, and welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders, Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Some Dude 267, Bright Line Blue, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mr. Black Rose Tribal Typhoon, Dark Lightning 1536, and Master of None. You are the reason why this content remains beyond the concept of mortal understanding. And today, we are going to discuss what is sometimes considered the worst train accident in American history. Now, this is debated as it's possible the Malbone Street Wreck that happened the same year as this in Brooklyn, New York, might have actually been just a little bit worse, but they're both about the same level of catastrophe. We might talk about Malbone some other day, but for now we're going to discuss what is commonly known as the Great Train Wreck of 1918. "1918 was not generally considered a great year for humanity in general, to be honest. World War I was still raging, and the Spanish flu epidemic was causing catastrophe all over the world beyond just the war. But our story focuses on Tennessee in the United States, and involves two passenger trains that were under the operation of the Nashville, Chattanooga and St. Louis Railway, or NC&StL. That railroad was an integral part of the United States rail network for many years, and they went through multiple ownership changes over the last century, and their lines are now a part of the CSX network. One of the trains, train number 4, was scheduled to depart Nashville, Tennessee for Memphis at 7 a.m. that morning. The train consisted of 2 mail and baggage cars, as well as 6 wooden passenger coaches. They were pulled by locomotive number 282, which was a G8A class 460 10-wheeler. We've discussed 10-wheelers on this channel before, but the G8As are actually probably one of the best examples, as they were considered a technological marvel for their time. They were fast, efficient, with a decent tractive effort, all this despite not being the largest locomotives ever built, and they would go on to serve till after World War II. The other train was train number 1. It was pulled by locomotive number 281, the sister of 282, and yes, they were both G8As built by Baldwin in the same year, 1905. Number 1 was on its way into Nashville from Memphis. It had 1 baggage car, 6 wooden coaches, and 2 Pullman sleeping cars of steel construction. Both engines were known to be operating within parameters on that day, but train number 1 was 35 minutes behind schedule. Number 4 was engineered by David Kennedy, and number 1 was engineered by William Floyd, and in a twist right out of every cliche imaginable, this run was supposed to be Floyd's last before his retirement. Number 4, departing Union Station in Nashville, was westbound and would eventually have to use a single track section of the line that was about 10 miles long. Standard procedure for this sort of situation, when there were 2 trains needing a single line, was that any inbound train, in this case number 1, would have retained the right of way. Therefore, number 4 would have to wait for number 1 to pass them before proceeding onto the single section of track. The railroad dispatchers informed the crew of number 4 that they were to stop in the double track section if they did not visually identify the passing of number 1 before they reached the interlocking tower, which was known as Shops Junction. It was at this junction where the single track section started. But as I said, number 1 was behind schedule, and was still on the single track section of the lines. While number 4 headed down the double track section, the conductor on board delegated the responsibility of identifying number 1 to the remainder of the crew. This is not standard procedure. That specific responsibility is his and his alone. But he wanted to focus on collecting tickets, and while he was doing this, he mistook the sound of a passing switch engine that had empty passenger cars as the number 1 train. The crew members he left in charge of identifying the number 1 train either made this same error or simply didn't bother to identify whether the train had passed or not. This act of negligence alone wouldn't have been enough to cause the accident, but further errors abounded. As number 4 approached Shops Junction, Engineer Kennedy observed the fact that the signal tower showed an all-clear signal. The tower's operator, J.S. Johnson, had mistakenly left the signal in this position, but when he stopped to record number 4's passing in his logs, he noticed in horror that number 1 had not passed. He immediately reported this to the dispatch office and received a telegraph message back saying, "He meets number 1 there. Can you stop him?" Johnson immediately sounded the emergency whistle, which was the only way he had of letting number 4 know to stop at that point. But at that time, there was no one at the rear of number 4's train to actually hear it. Engineer Kennedy had simply trusted the signal and assumed the track was all clear, and proceeded accordingly. Now, on the surface, it sounds like he didn't make a mistake there, the signalman did, but in accordance with policy, an engine man and conductor were supposed to stop and visually inspect the train register at Shops Junction to make sure that all opposing trains that were scheduled had already arrived before they proceeded at all. The train didn't even stop to begin this process, and it would have only been a few more minutes before Kennedy realized his error. Kennedy, in the number 4 train, would have looked on in terror as the number 1 train, engineered by Floyd, came into view. Both trains were traveling well in excess of 50 miles an hour, and though both engineers did slam on their emergency brakes to avert a catastrophe, there was simply no time to do anything about it. It was estimated after the crash that train number 4 must have been traveling about 50 miles per hour at the time of impact, while the eastbound train, number 1, was traveling about 60, meaning the trains impacted with a combined speed of 110 miles per hour. The wooden coaches that made up most of both of the trains crumbled under the strain of the impact. They were crushed or hurled sideways, and apparently the sound of the collision could be heard from 2 miles or 3 kilometers away. The accident made national news, and allegedly as many as 50,000 people came to the track the day of the accident to help in the rescue efforts, search for loved ones, or simply to look on. Most of the victims were actually African-American laborers coming from Arkansas and Memphis to work at a gunpowder plant in Old Hickory, just outside of Nashville. The official death toll, given by the Interstate Commerce Commission, was set at 101, but other reports listed the death toll as high as 121, and among those were engineer David Kennedy and engineer William Floyd. At least 171 people were also injured. The Interstate Commerce Commission obviously launched an investigation as to what happened, and they were brutal on the NC&StL Railroad. They felt that a combination of poor operating practices, human error, and a lax enforcement of their rules led to the accident. Any number of changes to the situations that led to the crash would have averted it entirely. Had J.S. Johnson properly put his signal at danger, had the conductor on board the train actually done his job and monitored the train's progress rather than trusting the rest of the crew, or had the crew on board number 4 stopped and actually checked the register as they were supposed to, 101 people would still be alive. The wooden coaches were called under question too, and it's believed that this crash was part of the reason why many railroads in the United States began using steel passenger cars, which would not have ripped apart quite as easily and perhaps saved some of the lives lost on that day. But incredibly, in some ways, despite being known as the Great Train Wreck of 1918, it kind of fell on the back burner when it came to some of the news media at the time. They did report on it, that's true, but there was a lot going on in the world at that point. Between World War I and the Spanish flu, reports of mass death and casualty across the world had become almost routine, and the mass media industry was looking to sensationalize it to make more money. Weirdly enough, some journalists seemed to think the accident just wasn't sensational enough, and preferred to focus on other things. This caused many to criticize the national news media of the United States at that time, regarding where their priorities were. Were they there simply to report the truth, or were they writing a story for their own benefit? It was a bad look, and to be honest, it's an issue with news media that people still have even to this day. As for the locomotives, 281 and 282, well, the sisters were actually rebuilt in 1919 and continued service for many decades. They survived past World War II and were both retired by 1948. Sadly, they would both be scrapped after their retirement. None of their other siblings survived either. The track itself is actually still there to this day. again under CSX's jurisdiction. Looking at it now, you'd never know this was the site of one of the worst train accidents in United States history, but over 100 years ago, it was. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.